In 1786, just a few years after the American Revolution, a small frontier town called Pittsburgh got its first newspaper. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, then known as the Gazette, was founded to serve a growing democracy, to circulate verified information, and to help a young nation argue its way towards the truth. For more than 2 centuries, that mission held. The paper exposed corruption, amplified unheard voices, and helped give Western Pennsylvania a shared set of facts. But today, the Post-Gazette is no longer a symbol of democratic promise. It's become a case study in something else entirely, the slow internal collapse of a once great news institution. Newsrooms hollowed out, journalists sidelined, editorial independence eroded. What was built to challenge power has increasingly struggled to function at all.
That unraveling is the focus of Requiem for the Post-Gazette, an essay by journalist Tony Norman. Tony spent decades inside the newsroom, watching the paper change and ultimately lose its footing. We're going to talk with Tony about the decline of the Post-Gazette, the forces reshaping American journalism, and why the loss of strong local news isn't just a media story. It's a warning about what happens when the Fourth Estate can no longer do its job. Tony Norman, welcome to News Over Noise.
It's good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
I reached out to you because I read your Requiem for the Post-Gazette, and it struck me that this is almost a perfect piece for encapsulating what's going on in the news industry right now. The fact that you worked at a paper for so long, and then the depth of local knowledge that you bring to that story is in a way precisely what makes local reporting so important. So when did you start working at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette?
I began in November of 1988. And I was at the Post-Gazette until August of 2022. So, pretty much 3 decades. And for the most part, it was very fruitful. I really enjoyed my time there. It was professionally a godsend in every way. It launched me into the solid middle class. When I started that job at the Post-Gazette, I was transitioning from a telemarketing position, and I had a son on the way, and newly married, and the whole thing. So it made quite a difference in my life and in my professional trajectory. I mean, I had always wanted to be a journalist, and that was a time when you could walk into a newspaper off the street with only a portfolio under your arms and basically ask for an assignment or a job or freelance or something. And folks were more than willing to entertain that. So it was a different era. And one that I'm going to miss very much, the camaraderie that came from working in a very large newsroom. The competition against another newspaper, and how that sharpens you as a journalist. There was just so much richness in my experience as a journeyman journalist. So I was profoundly affected by the announcement that the Post-Gazette would be suspending publication this May.
So you describe a big kind of change in the news environment, right? First, that you wanted to be a journalist. There are fewer and fewer people wanting to do that. But that it was a sought-after job in the center of a big city where there was competition between 2 big and strong newsrooms. How has that changed now? And when did you start to see some signs of that shifting?
Well, there was a strike in 1992 that resulted in the closing of the Pittsburgh Press. So already, I mean, I joined in 88. And so in 92, we already had an existential crisis, as it were, whereas formerly there were 2 newspapers. Now there was only 1 after the strike. And it changed the whole horizon in a way. There was still the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, but it was more of a suburban paper. But there was an intensity that began to lessen. And then from there on, the Post-Gazette, in a sense, became self-satisfied, as it were. It was the premier news gathering operation in Pittsburgh after that. We had partnerships with KDKA television, but I would say that when you think you're the only major news source, it changes the way you look at competition. It changes the way you look at a city. You become more myopic. You think you might have a monopoly. And I think that you begin to make decisions and choices that aren't always for the best in terms of your employees or the people you serve in a community, as a journalistic entity. You get arrogant. You get arrogant if you don't have people chasing you, as it were, if you're not in deep, deep competition with another entity. I think that's you need competition in order for democracy to thrive too. So that's my cockamamie theory of the case.
If we stay there on this point for a second, can you give us an example of how you feel like the move to one major newsmaker in the community with the Post-Gazette, one way that changed how the Post-Gazette thought about its coverage, whether as far as things that they wanted to cover more or cover less explicitly, or something that just kind of evolved implicitly as a result of not having that competition as you've described?
I think it was a slow evolution, and I think it had its apotheosis pretty much as we were approaching, like a few years ago, basically after the Trump election number one, in 2016, when the publisher felt at that point it was okay in a sense to thumb his nose, but its nose, let's say the institution could thumb its nose at the readers who clearly were anti-Trump. But the Post-Gazette followed a path of what it might have considered least resistance, which was embracing Trump and embracing MAGA, embracing all the things that our readers despise. And I think the logic was, well, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? The competition, as it were, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review is also a conservative newspaper. So what happens if you take what was formerly a center-left newspaper and begin to inch it over that line so that it becomes more avowedly right-wing or conservative? We're just giving the people what they want. It was the logic that was at play. And you saw the things that came out of that. You saw offensive editorials defending racist positions. You saw, I would say, a critical theory about what the George Floyd protests were about. You saw the firing of a popular political cartoonist, editorial cartoonist, who was, any day now is going to get a Pulitzer. Why would you get rid of someone who is such a cultural asset to the paper? Because he makes too much fun of Trump. And so the failure to read the room in Pittsburgh, the failure to understand that whatever is happening out in Fayette County and Armstrong County and some of the more conservative places, Butler and whatever, in Pittsburgh, where your bread and butter is still solidly blue and is not at all open to the idea of a MAGA newspaper and supporting it. And so I think that it was a gradual thing, but it was definitely there for maybe even decades, but it just sort of fell off a cliff. And then as you head to the pandemic and you head into, the shutdown of American life, the natural conservatism, of the publishers really comes to bear. And you end up with basically people quitting en masse. Basically, what you're seeing at CBS right now, basically, it wasn't through layoffs. It was just people decided, the most talented people, a lot of the most talented folks decided that they had had enough. And the Post-Gazette was really dependent upon the talent of its contributors, of its writers, of its editors, of all of that. And if they lost faith in the general direction of the paper, not just for ideological, but just for planning the damn thing. If the paper decides to unilaterally not honor its contracts, its union contracts anymore, and or if they do something really stupid, I mean, as the circulation of major newspapers is falling off of a cliff, in the middle teens, around 2014, 2015, and so forth. What do as an institution? We go out and we build a printing plant, a state-of-the-art printing plant, at a time when other newspapers are cutting back on printing. I mean, we just got hornsnoggled, fooled by someone who said, hey, what you people who are struggling with making your bills need is a new printing plant. And so in order to finance the printing plant, you take money from that is promised to the union and you use it to build this white elephant. And then all of the customers that you thought you were going to have, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all these papers that, need to be printed somewhere, in the mid-Atlantic states in order to distribute, cut down on their costs. Suddenly, you built this plant and those customers, for whatever reason, decide, nah, we're going to stick with our current printers. And you're stuck with no customers, or only you're doing flyers for supermarkets and printing your own paper. And sooner or later, you run out of the resources to print your own paper because labor costs money. So what do you end up with? Then you end up cutting days for your newspaper. So it's a total lack of foresight and planning on the part of the managers of the Post-Gazette.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what you're describing, a long series there, are sins of kind of commission, right? Things that were done that were, but there. It also strikes me that behind what you're saying are a lot of sins of omission, right? That when you're cutting reporters, like the stuff that comes through in your essay on the Gazette is just the amazing resources that each of these reporters, in terms of their knowledge of local context, their understanding of Pittsburgh culture, their understanding of all of that stuff. And that's precisely what makes local journalism so powerful, right? That it's got those people who are the knowledge people, right? And
right. The storytellers, the folks who are out there looking for the stories that folks find compelling, and they know their beats, and they know what real stories are, and they know how to convey it in a compelling way. I know I'm sounding redundant here, but there is that. I think the lack of respect for the people who created the wealth, as it were. Right. That's the problem with third or fourth generation owners. I mean, they really don't have much to do with the wealth creation of a newspaper in this case. Basically, they're the folks who inherit things. They're not even folks who have been in the trenches. And the folks who have invested the most in terms of their talent, in terms of just bringing their everything to bear to make this paper successful, are not consulted about the future of the paper. We're basically just pawns in a game. And so it doesn't take long before we feel less than invested. And then the normal labor management hassles exacerbate things. And the next thing you know, we're at loggerheads, and the outcome is going to be something really horrible, like the death of a newspaper that's been around for 2 centuries. So what does one say? What does one do about that? The family, understandably, I suppose, want to be able to get some money out of this. And so they're going to sell it to the lowest bidder in the end. And that's what we'll end up with. Either a hedge fund will come in, or there'll be another independent owner, another rich family, a mini Bezos, or it will dissolve, or if it's lucky, a nonprofit will figure out a way to bring back some of the talent, to continue their beats, or to bring in new, fresh blood, young reporters who don't have pension obligations, and just sort of bring them in and reimagine a non-physical newspaper, one that's online, but that one that still fulfills all the responsibilities that a daily used to do. We can't afford to become a news desert, and we won't become a news desert here in Pittsburgh. Something is going to arise out of the smoldering ruins, like a phoenix. Something will. The question is, what will it be, and whether it will be charismatic enough to attract enough readers to sustain it.
You said it can't fulfill the mission. In your essay, you say that the mission is to be the bulwark against civic ignorance and misinformation.
Yes.
Why is that it's so important in a city like Pittsburgh?
Oh, because we're a city of con men and women. We're a city of if there isn't anyone looking, crime will be happening. And I'm not talking about stick-ups and the minor stuff. I mean, that kind of crime is actually down. I'm talking about crime in the suites. And people here are very, I think folks give institutions the benefit of the doubt. And they don't understand that even the most revered institution needs someone to look over its shoulders. Otherwise, you end up with inadvertent or purposeful thievery. And that might be the attitude of like an old school, ink-stained wretch like myself. But without journalism, active journalism happening in a city like Pittsburgh, and I think all cities, but especially Pittsburgh, will trend towards entropy. And it's just obvious. The things that the Post-Gazette and other newspapers have lost sight of inevitably become like, those sores that explode, they're the rotten tooth that you ignore until you can't anymore. And that happens everywhere. Pennsylvania as a state, just sort of like is inclined towards that. I mean, we have the second biggest legislature in the country, I believe. Well, maybe it's third at this point. At one time, it was number one in terms of just the sheer size. And if you look at what's happening in Harrisburg, it's criminal. It's absolutely. But there was a time when the Post-Gazette and the Philadelphia Inquirer were all over Harrisburg. No one could take a fart in Harrisburg without us knowing about it. Now, everything that happens in Harrisburg, unless some of the smaller independent, like PA Spotlight or someone, catches it, we don't catch it. And Pennsylvania is crucial to the democratic survival of America. When you look at the machinations that the Trump administration is putting into play when it comes to the next vote, they have all these cronies. There are all these right-wing cronies spread across the state. But, and so many people of bad will in our legislature, that something horrible is bound to happen democratically that attacks our democracy. And who will be there to sort of ring the alarm before it happens? See, journalism is most useful before the disaster happens. Otherwise, it's just a postmortem that may or may not get out there. And I think that the crippling of the Post-Gazette or the elimination of the Post-Gazette and the fact that the Philadelphia Inquirer is now, a shadow of its former self is really bad news for what happens in Pennsylvania. And it's not just up to those two newspapers. I I think PA Spotlight, some of the other papers that have stepped up in recent years, actually do a magnificent job. It's just a matter of resources. They don't have the ability to allocate the resources that are really needed to cover this state the way it needs to be covered. But thank God for them, because at least there is an early warning system. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it, oh man, the Post Gazette, like collapses over, it's all apocalypse now. Yeah, not at all. But it would be better if the Post Gazette existed than not existed.
In your tenure at the Post Gazette, when did the coverage of Harrisburg start to dry up, or was that because that one of the things we saw here in Center County was that, I don't know, about 15 years ago, just that stopped being a beat. And was there something similar like that at the Post Gazette?
I think that was the late aughts, 2011, 2012. It was no longer a desirable beat because the resources have been cut back. And, what had formerly been like a 3-man bureau became a 1-man bureau. How can one person cover as juicy a territory as the Harrisburg legislature when our Washington bureau went from 3 persons to 1 person? So you often had Harrisburg and, Washington teaming up on a Harrisburg story, or, making a hybrid beat to cover state and federal. It's just too much for 1 person, 2 persons.
Right.
And so when we lost the sort of like, well, what are we here for? I mean, maybe we can cut back on something else. Maybe we don't need a sports desk that's 40 people. Maybe we can have a state capitol desk that is constantly 3 people at the very least. And maybe we need 2 people in DC, in order to cover what our senators and congressmen have to say.
Thinking about some of the effects of the erosion of the publication over the last 15 or 20 years, you mentioned both in your piece and in one of your answers earlier, the kind of effect that has on people who are still working there, right? That between the rumors and the cuts and the various experiences that people are having while they're still trying to do the best work they can.
Yeah.
I was hoping if you could talk a little bit more about what that felt like, for you and in talking to colleagues either during that time or subsequently, since you left the publication and now since this news has come out. I mean, can you give us a little bit more insight about just what it feels like to work at a place that, has this sort of reputation and a lot of people working there know what it feels like to do great work at a great place and then to feel it, slowly and then maybe more quickly erode and all of that kind of go away.
Right. The folks who had been there for a long time were feeling just a deep alienation from the owners, not so much from management, like our immediate managers were in the same boat we were in. So there was always a sense of like, we didn't realize how good we had it once upon a time. We didn't realize that, and I certainly didn't realize it, that when I joined the paper in '88, that was like the golden age, that all these eccentric characters, that all these great writers and these great editors and mentors and people who are just all around, you take them for granted. You just think that that's just part of like the milieu of journalism. You're surrounded by superior reporters who show you how to do things, or superior writers and do this and that and so forth. And you just sort of like gobble as much as you can. And you just, are incentivized to just sort of grow into a better writer and reporter and journalist. And then slowly the resources, like in Jenga, get slowly taken away, this board, that board, this and that, and so forth and so on. And as it's happening, you just think, well, this is not optimal, but we'll get through this. We're the Post-Gazette. We know how to get shit done. And it doesn't reverse, and then things start to deteriorate. And then, a lot of veterans begin to go, I think I'll take a buyout. And, the next thing the folks who have all the accumulated knowledge of, that amount to centuries of expertise are walking out the door. And next thing you got, another group of people coming in who don't share that rich history, who maybe come from shittier places, who find the Post-Gazette to be, Shangri-La. They're like, what are you people complaining about? This is great. You make decent money and this and that and so forth. But like a social contract has been broken, and we just hope that it doesn't lead to anything too crappy. We just assume we're going to be here 50 years from now. So let's do our part to continue telling great stories and so forth. But as it's happening, there's like the old hackneyed and like analogy, like the frog boiling in water. You do feel it, and but you don't know what to make of it, because you can't imagine that the publisher and his family would blow it all up. You just don't figure that's going to happen. It's like the farthest thing from your mind. And then, and meanwhile, so all of a sudden, there's a new, raft of people coming in, younger people, and you're trying to sort of like put your institution into context so that they can understand what it is they're coming into. And you fixate on happy days, and you just say there was a time and this and that, and you get wrapped up in nostalgia. And they're like, yeah, whatever, boss, but we're here to do a job and so forth. And for a while, that sort of youthful energy is enough to pull you forward. But then there's a different mentality there. Young people are not coming to stay forever like we did. A young person who is confronted with an offer from a bigger and better place, who doesn't have children or, a spouse, is going to take it in a second. So, our most talented young people who are, your ages, like young folks, took the deals. When the Washington Post, when Bezos bought the Washington Post and was offering large salaries and going on a hiring spree, I can't tell you how many Post-Gazette people he grabbed, but they were young people who had only been around for, not even a year in some cases.
Right.
He just took them. So what could we say to entice those people to stay? Nothing. And so there was just sort of like the institution began to feel more porous. Like it wasn't like a destination spot anymore. It was just like a place you went to wait for the Wall Street Journal and, the Washington Post to poach the, the most promising people. And that happened. And so there was like an end to that spirit, that esprit de corps. That began to just sort of like, that disappeared.
Yeah.
And the most inspiring editors, the most inspiring writers began to leave. And that was, again, in the teens, in the 20-teens. And then when the Post-Gazette moved from the Boulevard of the Allies in the city to the North Shore, by that time, the handwriting was on a wall. We moved from, admittedly, a crappy building, but it was like a gigantic building that had so much history in it. It was just an amazing, where our printing presses were. It was an amazing place to be, to hear the clanking of the printing presses all day and the smell of the ink, which probably gave all of us cancer. Who the hell knows? and just the vitality, the industrial vitality that was there. There was a connection between our abstract words and this very tangible thing that came off of the rollers every day that went out to people's, front porches. And they took them into the house and opened them at the kitchen table and read what we had to say. That was what it was all about. We were trying to make sense of what we were doing as the world moved on without us. We could not figure out a strategy like the New York Times later did, where basically they became, one of my friends said, the New York Times is a Wordle app that happens to have a bureau in Asia. It's like, it's a cooking app, but they figured out how to survive, to continue doing what they're doing, as a news source that is self-sufficient. There was a time when 2/3 of the New York Times was supported by advertising. Now, 2/3 of it is supported by subscriptions.
Right.
And that's what we all want to get to, obviously. How do we get to that? It may be that there's only the New York Times can figure that out. The Washington Post is dying on the vine right now. It's the Wall Street Journal is surviving. Are we just going to have national newspapers? Who knows? I think Pittsburgh is capable of producing both a local paper that has statewide importance and can continue to innovate on that front and be relevant to our readers. I think we have to think of ourselves as local, regional, and then conquer that, and then eventually make ourselves integral to every, our Harrisburg coverage has to improve, maybe even coverage of Philly, who knows? But Harrisburg is the key, Center County is the key. All of these places are, that otherwise will go uncovered are the key.
Right. You describe kind of the old folks in the newsroom versus the new folks. And it sounds like from your piece that there were some new people who came in and tried to kind of catch up with time in a way. In fact, you give a nice shout out to our Belisario colleague here, Mila Sanina, who was your managing editor for a while. What were some of the things that Mila was trying to do in terms of updating the delivery of the material?
Mila was just a visionary. Every day she came in with ideas. And she said that if we want to be a part of the conversation, we have to gear our stories towards the online space. We can't think of ourselves as strictly a printed product that, happens to also be distributed online. She wanted us to think about online first. And that was a profound paradigm shift for the people she worked with, for her immediate colleagues. I mean, Mila was I was a little fish, I was just, a writer and so forth. Mila was an editor. And she was in the meetings with all of these folks who had no idea what she was talking about. They had no idea about the technological implications of a journalism that originates online. They had no idea of what any of that meant. And so she's banging her head against the wall, trying to get folks to see why a change in direction was necessary. I'm not quite sure how long she was there. Maybe it was 4 years, 5 years, maybe a little longer. But I can tell you that every day she came in, with just determined to just get us just a little bit further down the road, towards modernity. and it was not always appreciated. So the fact that Mila was young and very well versed in the language of new media as opposed to old media, she was not trying to make it easy for the old folks to make that transition. She said, we have to move now. There's an emergency now. We have to do this. Look at what this paper is doing over here, like the New York Times or over there and so forth. We have to adapt some of these ways, you know. But she was not like a move fast and break things
Right.
person.
Right.
She was a move fast, deliberate while you're moving fast, but understand you have no choice but to move fast. And while you're moving fast, get used to the idea that you're going to have to move faster if you want to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And she was basically saying that at a time when people were like, we'll build a printing plant.
One way to look at what's happened at the Post-Gazette is to put it in context with so many other newspapers that have declined, if we want to use that kind of neutral term, over the last 25 years. But I'm curious, in your perspective, what is more specific or unique in this case to this particular institution that, makes it different from just the standard decline of print, people using the internet and then their phones to get news, declining ad revenue. All of those things are legitimate, right? And part of this story. But I mean, maybe beyond deciding to build a state-of-the-art printing press in like 2015, what else is sort of there that's specific to this story that you think really underlines why we're in the situation we're in now?
Well, this is probably going to sound brutal and unfair, but I think that the Post Gazette has lacked leadership or a vision or a strategy for so long that it was never able to get a good sense of what the horizon was. Let's use Mila as an example. It's almost like she came out of nowhere speaking, a language that no one knew, but she was absolutely right at every turn. There was just no system at the Post Gazette to reinforce her points or her vision, or there was no natural allyship amongst the either the owners of the paper or the managers of the paper or the traditions of the paper. It was unprecedented. And I think every decision that was made by an out of touch leadership just compounded our situation. It did not help that the leadership was not interested in being a partner to its labor unions. And its labor unions basically held the fate of the paper in its hands. And it was one of those Gordian knots. You couldn't figure out how to get out of this situation. And I don't think, and that's not any different. I mean, every newspaper has its own sort of, to quote Tolstoy or paraphrase Tolstoy, every family is, has its problems and has its own problems in its own way. Every newspaper has its own problems specific to it. But the Post Gazettes were the fact that we didn't have any leadership that could see beyond the bottom line, at any given moment, that did not have a sense of the future and did not have a sense of the possibilities of a strong regional newspaper that could take in the urban and the suburban and the exurban and all the various prisms of the Western Pennsylvania experience. What Mila and people like her were trying to do was to get us, the Post-Gazette leadership, to get out of its bubbles and the owners to get out of their bubbles and allow just a couple years of experimentation, to hit upon something that might work. There was like nothing to lose if we did something new that would get us the right kind of attention and devotion and love from the potential customers in Western Pennsylvania for our products. I know that's a sort of rambling attempt to answer your question, but I think it was just the fact that the PG, its biggest problem was that there was no visionary on board, and that there were basically two guys, John and Alan Block, who had no idea what was going on at any given time. They just wanted to like make sure that no one in the union felt comfortable, that the union was expendable, and that the workers were expendable, and that we should shut up and thank God for what they gave us. And so I think that was the biggest problem. I mean, cleverer people than me can probably look for, find other things. I think the problem was just, the leadership.
Ecosystems are always evolving, right? And as you said before, something will emerge in the place of the Post-Gazette. If you were to put on your prognostication soothsaying hat here for a second, what do you see emerging? And for example, who are you writing for now in terms of multiple outlets? What do you see kind of trying to fill that vacuum?
Oh, well, actually, right now I'm working on my novel, but there are multiple outlets. I mean, here in Pittsburgh, I think Public Source is probably going to be in the mix. There's talk now of there's a businessman by the name of Kevin Acklin, who is talking to various entities to make sure that there's a newspaper here in town, and he's leading a group of businessmen. And as we know, the problem with businessmen is that sometimes they have interests that are in conflict with what journalists do. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sitting around thinking that, the businessmen will save us. The businessmen never save us. I'm sure, if some car dealership decides to be a part of an effort to keep a newspaper in town, they want to make sure that whatever that entity is called or whatever it does, that it doesn't do any exposés on car dealerships. We could do a car dealership expose every damn week and never run out of folks to write about. But I mean, I believe, and it might be totally naive, but some of these efforts, there are just so many interested parties, so many writers and editors who want to see this continue, that something will pop. The Pittsburgh Union Progress is still in the game. They're going to come back, no doubt. There's going to be, I think you're going to see migration to Substack by a lot of really talented people who might sort of aggregate on Substack to make, to sort of like be a Justice League, as it were,
right?
Until they can figure out a way to formalize it and make it more than just sort of like, single personalities that are being followed. I actually am optimistic. There may be a lag. There may be like a lag of, 6 to 9 months, whatever, maybe a year. I swear I'm not dodging your question, but I don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
But I strongly believe that we're not going to be without local resources when it comes to reporting on what's going on. People will, the foundations may not want to put a lot of money into it right now because they're waiting for the dust to clear. Mm-hmm. But, someone's going to step up. And it may be half-assed at first, and then someone's going to see their example and improve upon it. And before you know it, as long as it's not printed, as long as no one is stupid enough to want to go buy the Post-Gazette's old printing press. It's going to result in something really, really beautiful and fascinating and important and necessary.
Well, I really appreciate that bit of optimism you ended on there, and I'm so thirsty for optimism these days that I'm going to use that and say thanks so much for joining us and sharing your story.
All right, guys, take it easy.
Well, Matt, a lot of great personal reflections from Tony, some positive on his time at the PPG, some obviously not so positive given where we are now with its impending closing in May. What's your primary takeaway from our chat with him?
I kept hearing this tug and pull in what he was saying in terms of the viability of the news ecosystems, right? That what happened to the New York Times, what happened to the Washington Post, what happened to the Wall Street Journal as their local readership dried up was that they tried to scale and go national. And that seems like that was also part of the attempt of the Post-Gazette to save itself as the kind of digital moment emerged. But it strikes me that that is, in essence, this conundrum that our local news finds itself in, where at the very same time that you're trying to make what is great about the local context, right? Your beat reporters who understand who the people are, what the issues are, and then how do you scale that to a national audience and without denudering it or neutering it of its importance, right? So I think this is one of the challenges of local news, especially when you have owners coming in who don't live there, who aren't invested in the community, but who want to scale this. What seems to be lost there is precisely that local context that allows that community to kind of travel through time together. So that's kind of what popped up for me. What about you?
You know, the thing that I kept thinking about during this chat with Tony is that it's really hard to be positive, despite his inherent positivity about what could come in the aftermath of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I sense the kind of optimism that I've read from people so many different times when smaller publications in smaller cities have closed. And I guess I'm just really scared, not by anything that Tony said specifically, but the sense that all of these really bad disaster scenarios that we've seen in the news industry happening in smaller places, but then slightly bigger and now slightly bigger and slightly bigger, are now reaching places like Pittsburgh, right? And in that whole kind of Western Pennsylvania area where, what we imagine even to be a news desert in 2026 is going to be redefined by the end of this decade in a way that I'm sure there will continue to be great individual reporting and nonprofits and people coming together on Substack. It just feels like it's so difficult to be able to get over the hump of that scale problem, right? That we're talking about today and we talk about so often. And so I do love the optimism, but I'm also in the back of my head thinking I've heard this before from a lot of people who are working in smaller communities, and now that's just coming to other people's doors who never thought it would happen to them, right?
Right. And I guess what you have to hope will happen is that the reasons that people are optimistic, which is, I think from him, it's like his optimism comes from his read of the community, that, nature abhors a vacuum. Something will come into that vacuum to give that community what it needs. So it's important for all of us to invest ourselves in that community, and part of that can be buying a local newspaper when you have one, and all of those things are what can, I think, the cycle of optimism or the virtuous circle wheel of optimism. So yeah, it's a conundrum. That's it for this episode of News Over Noise. Our guest was journalist Tony Norman. To learn more, visit newsovernoise.org. I'm Matt Jordan.
And I'm Cory Barker.
Until next time, stay well and well informed. News Over Noise is produced by the Penn State Donald P. Belisario College of Communications and WPSU. This program has been funded by the Office of the Executive Vice President and Provost at Penn State and is part of the Penn State News Literacy Initiative.